You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host, Ken Vellante. Editor and producer, Peter Bauer.
I think I've probably asked you this before, but I'm so curious about why you started this podcast and what you're trying to do with it.
Oh, thank you. I don't get to talk about it too much, but I about 4 years ago, I was going through like a really rough, just kind of personal situation, a lot of work stress, like everything was like pressure cooker type of thing, which I'm sure you feel sometimes.
Yep.
But I was going through that, and I started painting, and I have never had any formal art training. The one thing I did do was study a philosophy of art course, which was obviously very influential on like me and thinking about art. But when I started painting, I had this kind of like flurry and rush of creativity and way of identifying and expressing myself, which I never had. And I was 46. I'm 50 now, so it's just like I do union work, which is has these aspects of being so mundane. I had all this energy to be like over here, and I developed that. And so I started the podcast because I wanted to see if I could, and I wanted to honestly and genuinely, my intent was to talk to artists, interesting, great artists, thinkers, creators. And I just kept going with it because I've been learning like a lot. I'm very curious, like,
Nice.
and so, I got a master's in philosophy. I got a master's in labor studies. So it's like these things are very connected for me, but there's like thinking and creativity is like incredible. I've learned so much from guests. I love what you do and your work and your animation. I find it. The one thing I wanted to say, everybody, we're talking to Elyse Kelly, and Elyse is an animator, artist, instructor in the arts that very excited to have here. Elyse, welcome to the Something Rather Than Nothing podcast.
Thank you so much, Ken. I'm excited to be here and cautiously optimistic that I won't ramble too much, but we'll see how it goes.
This show is based on rambling, so it's incentivized. It's incentivized.
I love
it. Well, I think I could say that I saw your work. I saw your work and more recently in The Dark of the Valley, which was an Emmy nominee. And I will, in all hopes of openness, say that the animation on Miss Americana, I'm a huge Swiftie. I saw that, and I thought it was so amazing, and I thought it was so important how it was visually depicted. So I saw that, and I've seen the other work that you've done on Neon Zoo, your studio. We're talking being nominated for awards, and the beautiful, I would say, lyrical animation and all that, and all that build up. How did you get into the position where you were creating animation in this way?
Oh, I feel like that's the perfect question for a ramble.
You got it.
But I think what I would start with saying is that all of those projects that you just mentioned, including my studio that I actually recently launched, is all thanks to the brilliant artists that I have the privilege of working with. It's not just me. I think depending on who you're talking to in the animation world or even the filmmaking world, sometimes people are kind of doing things themselves and, kind of being scrappy and just making things work. And I definitely do a lot of that. But I don't do it alone. And so I think the reason that oftentimes so much of this work resonates on so many levels with people is because of the kind of heart and soul and dedication that everyone on my teams are putting into these projects. And to kind of step back on the broader question of how did I get here, not linearly, and speaking to the fact that I do teach animation as well, I try to kind of underscore and stress to my students that your path in life isn't always linear. For those that it is, kudos to them. I am jealous of them. They have their direction and they go through the motions and they kind of achieve things in a very direct way. And for the rest of us, I think kind of being more open to it being a process is oftentimes what happens, I think, more often than not. And so I started out as someone who wanted to work in animation. I'm one of those quintessential, I love Disney, I must work at Disney. That was my childhood. And I think a lot of
magic.
animators, exactly. And a lot of people, I think, in animation, at least in the States, that kind of is a starting place for a lot of us. But it was a kind of a meandering journey, and I don't know how much you want me to get into it. But the highlights are I studied architecture in undergrad. Okay. And in my head, that was the more grown-up route to go of I was good at math and I was good at art and I loved them both. And architecture felt like this perfect synthesis.
What did it feel like for you, though? What did working in architecture or studying, what did it feel like? Did it not just quite, connect for you? Or
yeah, I really enjoyed it. But weirdly enough, I always was kind of thinking, I think, a little bit as an animator, to the point where one of my last projects in school, I designed a building that walked so that I could animate it.
Wow.
It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. And I think also the particular program I went to, which really created a great, strong foundation for just how I approach kind of creating and even like critique and working with teams, was much artsier than I thought. It wasn't the balanced math and art and science that I thought it was going to be. So it was kind of by the end, well, like I may as well just lean in and like go all in on this animation thing. So I went to grad school for animation, and I got my master's specifically in animation, and worked out. I was in Los Angeles for a little bit, worked and freelance there, but it just wasn't working. I'm sure you've talked with a lot of artists. Creative careers can be quite volatile. And at that time, it just was a little too volatile for me. So I escaped Los Angeles, as I like to say, and I moved to DC, which is where I am now. Not thinking that I would stay here for so long, but I have officially been here for 10 years now, Ken, which is crazy to think about. I thought I'd, pit stop here and move to New York and try again. But when I was here, I did a bunch of jobs that weren't in the industry. I really did leave Los Angeles saying like, it didn't work out. That's okay. I'm going to find a new path. And I eventually kind of found my way back, but it was not that plan that sometimes as kids we have in our heads, right? Of like, this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to do it. I even have students now who have their life mapped out in bullet point form. And I commend them, but also try to talk them through setting expectations and what happens when things go differently than you anticipated. Because you never know.
Yeah. There's a lot, and there's a lot in what you had to say, and I think I think about paths, whether they're artistic or professional. It's a very difficult area. I myself, my daughter goes to the University of Oregon, but I'm also a mentor to mentees at my where I got my master's in philosophy, which is Marquette University. And so I've done that for a few years. So I definitely know I have a lot of conversations, in life conversations. But as far as students or people going through the process for the first time, trying to understand where to go, what to do. And I heard when you were talking about because when I heard you talk about architecture and then how you made the building walk and move, it seemed like to me, just hearing you describe it, was like your energy was in all this motion, and it was just like it seems like you could do a still, right? But it's not the still for you. It has to be all running together and going
Yep.
somewhere. That's why that building is walking.
Absolutely.
So
Why not bring it to life, right? And have it be a living, breathing thing. And also, while all of my friends were interning at architecture firms over the summer and during the holidays, I was working in a motion capture lab. So I think in part, my heart was always in animation, and I tried to do what felt like a grown-up thing to do and not choose a career in art. Not because I think anyone told me that I couldn't or shouldn't, but that thing we make up in our heads of like, this is what I must do
yeah.
to be a grown up, to be an adult. So it took me a little bit to get to that place and just embrace it and see what would happen.
Yeah, and it takes some courage in that. I mean, I think anybody who's tried new things or tried to go a different direction, when you do that, it's that gasp of air for a little while of like, when are my feet going to hit the ground? Like, just where's my stability? And kudos to you for doing that. So within your answer, one of the questions I tend to ask is, when did you see yourself as an artist? I mean, I think it's within the answer that you gave, but like, was there like you walk out and you're like, man, this is what I am. This is what I do. Like, that's that. Was that an experience for you, or a time that happened?
That's a great question. I think it's constantly a process and continuing to evolve. I think a lot of people who become artists or work in creative fields have sometimes, I don't know if two sides is the right way of putting it, but we have that kind of creative energy and enthusiasm, but that also comes with a lot of questioning and doubt. And I was actually just having lunch the other day with a few other friends who work in film, and we were saying that very thing of when you start to make your own work, it becomes much scarier, and you're afraid to share it a lot of the times. And one friend was saying that they'll apologize for the work when it's their own, versus when we're working with clients or on other projects, it almost is liberating creatively in a very unexpected way, because like we can kind of run with things and it's not anchored to something quite as personal. So it definitely took me a long time to get here. Obviously, when I moved to DC, I wasn't thinking that I was an artist or I was going to be working in art ever again. I actually worked, when I first moved here, I worked in a cheese shop. And
I read that.
Telling you what,
I read that.
Canada's the best job I've ever had.
You enjoyed that experience. Yeah.
It was fantastic. I think there's a lot to be said about having a job that you work really hard at, but at the end of the day, you leave and you don't, you kind of,
sure,
close that door for the day,
sure,
and you kind of live your life. And it helped me kind of learn about balance, which I'm very bad at, between, life and work and living and all of those things. But yeah, it kind of was a process. And even when I started working in animation again after kind of taking a few years to regroup and find my path. I did not consider myself an artist. I did not call myself a director. I often hid under the guise of saying that I was a producer because I like checklists and I like being organized. And I didn't feel like, even though I was writing and developing the ideas and building the team and working creatively with everyone, because I wasn't actively doing the art, I didn't think I was the artist. And quite frankly, it wasn't until a dear friend and collaborator who's also an animation director and filmmaker told me that I was.
Well, sometimes it would
flat out said it, right?
Yeah.
I was like, I was trying to figure out, like how to approach projects, and I was telling him like what I do and my role, and he just stopped me and he was like, Elyse, you're a director. And I was like, but I'm not doing the art and I'm not making the animation. He's like, it doesn't matter.
Stop it.
And so I really do. I'm very grateful for that frankness from him, because it did help me shift my perspective. And it's been a journey over the last few years since then, and it continues to evolve. But I've learned to embrace it, I think, a little bit more. And I think the exciting part of working in these collaborative spaces is like, me being creative doesn't negate me giving space for someone on my team to also be creative and have a voice and contribute, so that we all have some sense of ownership of the work that we're doing together.
Yeah. I think the identity piece is part of the philosophy behind it, and part of the discussion of when do you see yourself as it. And on the identity question, I've just tried to ask it so many different ways throughout the show to be like, because at times, I mean, it happened for me, and I've lived 50 years, and when the last 2 or 3 years, I would use that term as applied to me. That has meaning, significant meaning in my life, and it's a huge statement and affirmation, at least personally, as a personal experience. And just like you were resistant to being like, I'm not doing it in this way, so I'm not doing it. And somebody's like, no, like, you are here pulling this together and putting it, you are doing it. And sometimes you need to hear that from somebody else and say, hey, yeah, it's you. That's part of you. That's what you are.
Mm-hmm.
In a positive way. That attribution isn't always great. Yeah. This is what you are, but the positive, just take the role. You're doing it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. This is kind of nerdy, but I don't know if you've watched the behind the scenes series of the making of Frozen 2.
I have not, but I would be very open to, because I love the Frozen movies.
Do you?
So I just didn't know about this piece, but tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, I think that was another place where it kind of reaffirmed that, like, creativity does have different forms, and obviously that, it's just like a little series, online series, but they follow different artists and the directors throughout the production. And there's one sequence where it really is the directors, and it's just them walking from room to room to room to room. Wow. And they're having creative conversations with all of the different members of their team, and talking about big picture story.
Dynamic energy.
Exactly. And the importance of each person's component and how that ties back to what they're trying to do. But it really was, they were just going from meeting to meeting to meeting. And I was like, I do that. Like, I go from Zoom call to Zoom call to Zoom call with all of the people on my team.
You have to have those abilities and capabilities to be able to navigate, sure.
To have those conversations. And the fact that, one of the directors was one of the writers on that film, but they weren't, and obviously, a film like Frozen 2 is a giant production with hundreds and hundreds of people. But I think seeing it even at that caliber, that kind of silly little thing in the back of your head of like, oh, well, they're not drawing. They have a brilliant team of fantastically talented people that they're working with, and they're guiding and they're inspiring creatively. And that's their role a lot of the times as the director. And I was like, I'm just doing that on a very small scale.
Well, the thing is, I don't think humans have ever been really good at like being able to understand mental labor, physical labor, the integration of these type of labors. And I think that's part of it. I think if folks are paid whatever you do, we're paid for our minds in part. I think that when you are, there's a lot of just kind of professional decisions and autonomy that I think you want to take into account. That opens up a whole big front. Elyse, it's been, hey, I want to ask you this. I read something about one of your productions, and I want to read you this. And at the end of this description of what you've done, I want to ask you, the question's going to be, how did you do this? All right. So in 2021, Elyse co-directed The Forgotten Four, 6-episode animated series for Meow Wolf's Convergence Station, an immersive experience based in Denver, Colorado. She built and directed a team of over 50 artists from around the world to produce films that both stand alone and weave seamlessly into the physical experience in Denver. How did you do that?
I don't know how we did it. I didn't do it alone. I think that's always going to be my answer. We really had the greatest team of people from truly all over the world. And I think when I was joking before we were recording, when you asked me, what don't I do? And I said, sleep. I think that's part of it. I think finding the best artists, no matter where they are, is always one of my favorite parts of starting a project. But then that turns into so many time zones and making sure everyone has what they need. And then, your role as the director is to not sleep. No, I reject that. Anyone who's listening, don't listen to me. Have healthy work-life balance.
The sleep behavior is not to take a bunch of the advice. You're questioning your own sleep behavior and comment. Yeah, exactly.
Do the exact opposite of what I do. But I think that project was really exciting because the client, essentially in this case, which was Meow Wolf, are artists themselves, which was really refreshing because they were obviously coming at it from an art perspective, a storytelling perspective. So even before we started the animation, they folded us into the kind of end part of their script writing process, so that we could start to see where these narratives and these stories were going and start to craft it and finesse it based on what we felt was most impactful and effective, using animation specifically as a medium for storytelling. And I had a really great co-director, Jason Carpenter, who is actually that person who told me I was a director back in the day. Bless his heart. He really has made a lot of impact throughout my career at different stages. So we really worked in tandem, not only with each other and our team, but Meow Wolf, to figure out the best way to kind of bring these stories, and they're about essentially 4 women to life in a really exciting way. And I think the thing that was very different about that production than a lot of the other work that I've done is that there is a physical space in Denver that's kind of like we've described it, and I don't know if Meow Wolf would describe themselves in this way, but Disney World meets Burning Man. So kind of location, right?
Well, thank you. You've captured my interest in a few other 100 people. Yes,
I know, right? It's I think the generic way of describing it is location-based entertainment, but it's obviously so much more than that. And it really is, the organization was started by people who are brilliant, independent artists, experimental artists. And so all of the animation and the worlds that we were designing, that were all kind of in this sci-fi fantastical space, were then worlds they were building that you can visit in Denver. So it wasn't just that we were making these animations based on these scripts. We were making animations that also would be reflected in a physical way. And the extra component of that is that it didn't exist yet.
Yeah.
While we were making the animation, they were building the space in Denver simultaneously to us working on the production of the animation. So it was a lot of big picture creative conversations, trying to get a sense of the tone and the feeling of these worlds, seeing a lot of their production art and their development process, and kind of trying to get into their heads as much as possible so we could take what we were starting to see them doing and kind of reinterpret it in a way that was authentic to what they were trying to achieve. But again, I think was also served best for the animation. So it was a lot of fun. We had a lot of crazy conversations. There's this 6-dimensional being in the films that kind of weaves in and out of the storylines. And so we had a lot of very existential crisis-esque, I don't know, maybe it was just me, conversations of what is a 6-dimensional being? What does that mean? What are they? How do they react and reflect the world, engage with the world? And so it was a very exciting and challenging endeavor to go on, especially as someone who oftentimes works in the documentary space. And that was the same for my co-director, Jason. A lot of our work is in documentary. And so this is, on the outside, very different, right? Like, you couldn't be like in the dark of the valley talking about, these moms fighting all of these giant organizations for the cleanup of essentially like a nuclear waste site versus this trippy sci-fi 6-dimensional almost kind of multiverse convergent story. Couldn't be more different, but I think Jason and I both came to it in a similar way as documentary. At the end of the day, like, who are these characters? What are their stories? What are we trying to say about them, and trying to bring that authenticity into the storytelling in a way that, at the end of the day is what hopefully people who are watching this stuff are ultimately connecting with, right? And kind of like getting drawn into those worlds and those stories.
Your description of the project, first of all, wow. That's, beyond intrigued. But your description of the process seems to me like, in terms of building, it's where your architecture thinking must become like super active, because I could see, like, when we talked about it earlier, just in the sense of that static piece versus movement, but in whether it's dimensions or me just beginning to grasp the ideas that are behind the project, which is why I asked the question, because it was such a big idea, like, practically how, and then what is the thing. So I appreciate that. But it seems like you're conceptually using that with the architecture, what the places look like or how they would look like in real life, and that. So I'm thinking you get to play within architecture in a way that certainly the traditional path wouldn't have lent to you in terms of space.
Absolutely. I think you're totally right. And I never really thought about it in terms of connecting back to my work in school studying architecture. But it really was, when we were studying, not just about the act of designing a building, but the kind of meaning behind it. And like I said, it was a more liberal arts program than I anticipated, but I think it was good in the sense of of thinking about the why behind all of your choices. And that is something that we're always talking about in animation is we can do anything in animation, right? It's not like live action where you have to deal with, four walls of a building or access to spaces or people or even gravity. We really are unbound. And so thinking about then, if you can do anything, what is kind of driving your creative decisions? And how does that support every step of the way the story that you're trying to express, I think kind of helps you construct it in a very thoughtful way.
Yeah. Wow, what a project in thinking about it. One quick little personal note. I mentioned to you, Elyse, before that I had lived in Washington D.C. a couple of years, and a very influential friend of mine, his name is David Armour, who's has an architecture firm in San Francisco, very talented artist, architect. And I learned so much from him moving through Washington, D.C. with his knowledge of architecture. I'd never been around, so I didn't understand anything about architecture. I didn't know nothing. It was all fancy stuff, big fat books that are expensive.
Yeah,
But I walked
so
around,
expensive.
so expensive, right? But I walked around with him, and I began to just really think and understand like space and how things are proportioned where I never did before. So it was like a gift that I got. And then I began to think about architecture. One other piece I had recently, and you might be intrigued by this, a guest, Pam Valfer, and she has the band Kitty Craft, which is kind of really cool band going back. And always check them out. But we had an amazing conversation about architecture, and it was unexpected because I don't feign to know a lot about it, but I love when I have the opportunity to re-engage with that. Okay, all this is to say, Elyse, that we do have a couple other conceptual questions, of which I'm really interested to hear your answer. And the first big one, which you might have grappled with or didn't want to grapple with, is what is art? You're an artist. What is art?
I was afraid you were going to ask me these big questions. I know you told me you were going to ask me them, and I went, I'll figure it out when we get to it.
That's fine. We're all figuring out when we get to it ultimately.
Right? I think if I were to be a little cheesy about it, art can really be anything, and I think it can come in many forms. And maybe this is in part thinking about my students, because a lot of them, when they get into my class, they haven't done art or taken an art class since they were very, very little. And as you can imagine, a lot of my students who are at Georgetown aren't going to Georgetown for the arts necessarily. It's not something you would think that they're seeking out. So seeing them start to find ways of expressing themselves in a different form, I think is kind of what I always go back to in terms of thinking about what art is. It doesn't have to be of a certain caliber or a certain style. It really is about that expression and being able to capture a feeling or an emotion or a moment in time in a way that you might not be able to articulate in another way, and kind of watching that kind of come together and click for a lot of them throughout the semester, I think is what has really opened my eyes into the power then of what art can be. It doesn't have to be this perfect festival-worthy, museum-worthy piece. If it helps an individual kind of process something, I think that's where I'm most excited in terms of like, this question of what art is and what does it do and how do we kind of engage with it, I guess I would say.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And asking over time, I've had guests sometimes where they're like, I think like that's the only thing. I don't know if like every art class I was in, they asked that, or I had to figure it out. And then others have been like, maybe it's just different experiences have been like, what the hell kind of question is that? And it's
Yeah.
legitimate responses. I mean, I think philosophy questions, philosophers are annoying in general. If you're around, I mean, I'm straight up, I'm trained around it. I've been around them. I've spent years around them. The questions are disruptive and they might make you laugh, but I don't know, you find out a lot. So here's this question related to what is art, but what is the role of art, and is that change? It's 2022. Things feel different for me than they did just a few years ago. Personally, it feels differently, just like the way the world is. The role of art, and has it tweaked or changed or recently?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm equipped to answer that question, but I think you're right that it does feel like it's changed, simply due to the fact that there's so much content out in the world and we consume so much media. And obviously I'm thinking of media because I work in this kind of film and animation space. So it's not necessarily thinking about art on the kind of bigger picture scale. But there's so much, and I think that's good and bad. I'm not quite answering your question. I'm going on a tangent.
Hey, look, philosophers do that as well. You can,
right?
That's part of the thing with the show. There's nobody watching over this. It's
there you go. There you go. You're just all along for the ride. But I think it's changed. There's so much. It's so hard to cut through that noise and that kind of scrolling that a lot of us do. But I also, on the flip side, that accessibility in terms of being able to make art and content and be creative and finding your creative voice is exciting at the same time, especially to your point, thinking about when we were all in our Zoom spaces. And again, I keep going back to my students. I'm going to have to tell them I kept talking about them. But the fact that we were all stuck alone without real resources and we were still able to make, right? And we were still, maybe it wasn't as fancy because we were animating on our phones or animating with, in our closets at home or in the bathroom at home, but we were still able to make, and they were still able to tackle really big questions and really big, especially, right when we went virtual. There was a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of my students channeled that into what they were making. And so I think, maybe some people would say that art is not the same and it's being lost because there's just so much, and there's so much quote unquote crap out there. But I think there's also, because of that ability for more people to do things, there's a lot of potential and a lot of spaces to create magic in ways that you wouldn't necessarily have been able to previously.
Yeah.
I don't know, Ken.
Yeah. No, I think we're trying to figure, a lot of times people say, art's always going to be art. The sky's always falling in, right? I mean, if you look throughout, history,
always,
if there's one thing throughout history, I don't know if there's a dour point or a positive point, is that shit's really messed up right now. I feel like it. You ask me, you say, hey, is shit messed up? I would say yes, it very much is, and I'm worried, but a lot of people have been worried for a lot of time about a lot of things. And this isn't not to minimize what it is. It's just human beings in general tend to feel their own finitude, I think. So. Yeah.
And for better or for worse, this is probably awful to say, but maybe I won't say it. I think in these spaces where we're being challenged, it is when we are asking those tough questions of ourselves and of each other. And that oftentimes is what makes art kind of transcend to that next level, right? Because it's
becomes
not
something
just
else.
making to make, but it really is tackling kind of bigger issues in a way that I think also kind of then looking back on it becomes a really interesting time capsule. Yep, I said time capsule. Time capsule.
I like that word too. So yeah.
Of this moment, and it makes me think of I don't know if you've ever, how far down the independent animation rabbit hole you've gone, Ken. But one of my favorite animators that I discovered when I went to grad school for animation is this man named Yuri Norstein. He's a Russian animator, and he was quite prolific during the Soviet Union when they had kind of state support and funding for film and the arts. But he made some beautiful, beautiful films that kind of have so many different layers to them, and they work on kind of a surface level, oftentimes kind of like fun, magical realism stories and just things that feel sweet and for children. But as you dig deeper, you find all of this meaning and thought and reflection behind them that I think really speaks to those moments in his life and those moments in our histories that kind of are infused into the kind of work and stories that he ended up telling.
Yeah, it's there's so much there. It's really rich. And at least some tough questions. I want to say about Disney. I had a guest on, Eleanor Wells, who's quite the gifted director. She's in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area, and she talked to me. Her production company is called Cinderella Pictures, and just about the influence of Disney and these images and just people tend to react really strongly to when you say a Disney, and I've been really interested in conversations around that, because like Disney and whatever the worlds it creates have been really important for people to watch or go through or experience, or as kids and things like that. Is what I mean, I love Disney as well. I like the fantasy of it, but I was definitely in a different camp for most of my life, being like, no, like that stuff's like, I don't know, it's like whether it's mind warping or it's like this kind of commercialized type of thing, like in my head. But I began to realize within the wonder of that animation, and when it was done well and was representative of cultures, was a proper representation, whatever that might be exactly, that they're wondrous pieces of art. And so I think that's something to deal with. And when you're talking about Frozen, I love Frozen, but everyone makes fun of me for liking Frozen. My kids like Frozen, and then Frozen wasn't cool anymore. What happens with me, even when stuff isn't cool anymore, it doesn't matter to me. I tend to respond to it the same way. So I'll be talking about Frozen and Frozen 2, and they're like, nobody talks about no more. And I'm like, why? I still want to talk about it. All right, what am I asking? Right? I don't know. Tell me about Disney. Tell me about Disney. Tell me you think Disney's cool.
I know that Disney is obviously contentious or polarizing for certain peoples, and obviously I already told you that the reason I went into animation is because I wanted to work for Disney. So I think there will always be a place in my heart, because it really started that love for this medium and way of telling stories, that I think, that those first moments when you realize that grown-ups do this for a living, and you're like, what? And it's just so exciting, and it opens up so many possibilities. And I still watch Disney movies, which my niece and nephew really appreciate, because I'm just as excited oftentimes as they are, and all the other, adults are doing their own thing, and I'm sitting there with the two of them, and we're watching the movie together. But I think maybe something that I don't know if your guests have touched upon, that is something that a lot of people in the animation world kind of notice or discuss, is this idea that because of Disney's, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't find the right word. Presence in the US in particular, as like just how a lot of us have been introduced and consumed animated content from when we were little, and because of the type of storytelling that they do, this kind of very, family friendly, child oriented stories, that people don't realize a lot of the times in the States that animation doesn't have to be for kids. And I think that's something that we see a lot, especially around like award season. I think it actually happened this past Oscars. There was a lot of frustration in the animation community because of how they introduced the animation categories this year, and kind of playing off the princess vibes, playing off the for kids, and the parents in the room are going to roll their eyes because they've watched this movie 1,000 times with their 5-year-old, and not thinking about it. I guess going back to your questions and our discussions about what is art, that animation really is something that we kind of are broken records on, is like animation isn't a genre, it's a medium. Like a genre is a type of story. A medium can be used to tell any story, right? And I think in the States, because we're so entrenched in a lot of younger audience-driven content when it comes to animation, there's this perception that it can't do more than that. And it's not kind of, taking away from the power of the stuff that we have here, and what is being done, and the people who are challenging that and pushing boundaries. But it's far more acceptable, maybe isn't the right word, but far more of just an accepted way of filmmaking in Europe or in Japan, where it just happens to be animated, but it can be any story. And I think one of the reasons that people got so upset this year at the Oscars is one of the nominees was this film called Flea. Have you heard about it?
Yeah.
So it's I'm going to do the log line totally wrong, but basically it's essentially a documentary that is animated, for one reason being, safety of the subjects, and making sure that they weren't revealing who they were, because it was, they couldn't showcase who they were in real life, just because it was, years later after all of these events have happened, it is still an issue. It's about these kind of immigrants escaping. And obviously that's not doing the film justice. It is a beautiful, beautiful, rich, complex film about these really strong and powerful characters. But that was nominated for Best Animation, Best Foreign Film, or International Film, I think they're called now. Is that the new name of the category?
I'm not sure, yeah.
And Best Documentary. It was nominated for all three. And the way the category was introduced was still this kind of very diminutive, focused, narrow focused kind of interpretation of it. And again, I keep going on tangents, and I don't know what the point I was trying to make here is that
We were talking. I gave you a question.
Disney, right? Like,
Yeah,
I think Disney, it's brilliant, and I love Disney, but I think it, for better or for worse, for a lot of people, it's kind of pigeonholed our thinking into what we can do with this type of storytelling, and kind of like challenging those notions, myself included. Like, I went to school for animation with that Disney mindset, and I got there and I went, oh no, there's so much I didn't know, and there's so many ways you can take this art form, and so many stories that you can tell with it, and it's just finding the right way to tell your story, whether it's with animation or documentary or music or, you know, like audio. What is the best way to serve what you're trying to do and what you're trying to tell, and not putting labels on it in a way that kind of, you know, shuts people down and makes them not necessarily want to engage in something because it feels like it needs to be kind of categorized in a particular way.
Yeah, I understand that, and the complications around that. And I'd say, you know, I think the thing is, and just and maybe as a final point about Disney, I think it's you end up approaching it different ways. And I think you're talking very much in particular how the influence of it upon how I don't know, not probably using the right term, genre or the category is it as it develops. And I think when I think about it, because Disney I see as, you know, I'm a labor union guy, so I see that I've seen them have inclusive practices that have been very progressive, and I've seen them as a company in recent times taken on hate in closed-minded thinking within the workplace and otherwise. And so I think when you look at it that way, you're talking about one thing. And I think if you look at it like where you like Pocahontas, right, and the fictional tale. I mean, when you talk to some indigenous folks, the first missing and murdered indigenous woman was Pocahontas, and a fairy tale around that creates a. So you can look at these when you mention Disney in different ways, what they do with the category, what the medium is, and I just started thinking about it myself when I had 2 or 3 more conversations, because I think there's a knee jerk reaction being like, sometimes it's so reverential towards Disney, or sometimes it's dismissive. Oh, Disney, like that's a whole thing. So I don't know. Maybe there's a bunch of Disney conversations to be had. So for the first time,
your spin-off podcast can be all about Disney.
It will be a Disney one, but I would also say now in this episode, for the first time, we transition from Disney to the big question. Elyse Kelly, here we go, from Disney to why is there something rather than nothing?
Because then what's the point? Can I just end it with that?
Yeah. You can end unless I had more. I might not have other questions there, because what's the right? Isn't that what philosophy is? What's the point? It has to be that way. Otherwise,
then why are we doing what we're doing? And why are we doing it? There's no method to the madness. There's no reason. If there was nothing, then...
I got a question that I don't want to forget to ask. I mean, when you're talking, I try to note some, and because there's a few other things, but I did want to ask, or I want to make a statement and then a question after that. So in seeing your work and you describe in a couple pieces we've talked about, In the Dark of the Valley and Speech Wars, Smart Justice, and Miss Americana, the issues being handled, discussed, animated in these pieces are very important. The content is very important. The questions of justice and things like that. I'm going to ask a naive question related to that. Is that by accident, or like how do you because these aren't what you're working on is important within the social political context as well. So I think when you're animating within that, it has this, I don't know. I'm an art activist, so I've appreciated the importance in how where individual rights, environmental injustice in the dark of the valley, mistreatment of women and prominent women, Taylor Swift and Miss Americana, where the hand you lay in telling the story helps drive the point home.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that's why I'm really drawn to doing animation in like documentary and nonfiction spaces, is because I think what's really exciting is that, because, as we were talking about earlier, you can do anything with animation, which means that we're not tied to the reality of a particular space and time and moment. And when we're thinking about the impact of an event that can be so pivotal in someone's life, and trying to express that, again, goes back to sometimes you can't express it in a literal way. You can't express it in words. So with animation, we can use motion and color and an abstraction to kind of capture that experience in a way that is authentic, but an authentic in a way that's in a very kind of internal, personal way versus authentic, especially when we're thinking of documentary of like set in this particular location and space and time. And it's been really exciting as I've continued to work on kind of pieces in that space to figure out how to walk that line of capturing a person's real, honest experience and using animation in a way that honors and respects that.
Yeah.
Because I think oftentimes, again, actually, in the dark of the valley was the last time that I heard this. Oftentimes people will say, why are you turning me into a cartoon?
Uh-huh.
Right? And that perception of animation equals cartoon equals silly equals not the best way to represent particular stories. And then when we show them what the possibilities are, they start to go, okay, you're right. Like, there is no way for me to articulate this in a way where I can show it, except for the fact of using metaphor, visual metaphor, and doing things that you wouldn't necessarily think right off the bat.
Turning somebody's body to be very huge or very small to reflect the back and forth. And then they look at it and say, oh, well, yeah, that's kind of,
Exactly. What is the best way to capture that emotion? And it doesn't necessarily, if we're quote unquote skewing reality, it doesn't make it less valid. It oftentimes makes it more connected to how they felt in those particular moments.
Yeah. No, I that creative possibility within animation, which is what you started when we first started talking. I hear that like in this point very clear. Elyse, tell us, before we let you go, tell us, or tell the listeners, tell me about Neon Zoo Studio, and what that is, what people can find there, how they find your works and what you do, because there's quite a few amazing projects. So where do people go? What do they do?
Yeah, we're scheming over here. So Neon Zoo is our little independent boutique, however you want to describe it, creative animation studio. And we officially launched and announced our name earlier this year. And if you want to find us, it's a little bit annoying, but it's neonzoo.co, so C-O, no M at
I
the
noticed
end.
that. It stuck out. It stuck out, yeah.
It was not what we wanted, but we're making it work. But I think the reason we came to this point is for the last, 5 to 6 years, I mentioned that I'm working with these really, really amazingly talented teams. And it's not just me. Oftentimes I'm directing or I'm producing. So you would think that, it's quote unquote me, but it's so much more than that. And for the longest time, the kind of public persona, at least on the onset, was that individual. And when I started to, then talk to people and begin collaborations, it would come out that, we're building crews with people from around the world based on the needs of projects and what makes most sense creatively and story-wise. And it felt like the next step was to better reflect what we were already doing, that we essentially have a little studio running over here and we're making productions. And I wanted it to be less about me and more about us and our work. And it took a really long time to find a name and to start figuring out our voice. And we're still figuring out our voice and what it means and what it looks like. But I think already it's feeling like it better encapsulates, this group of magical unicorns and what we're trying to do and the stories that we're excited to tell. And hopefully it also opens up doors so that, it's not just me leading productions. It's other artists, and we're creating a support structure and network to kind of help people and championing the things that they want to tell as well, or at least that's the hope. We'll see how it evolves, but we're cautiously optimistic.
Well, there's a lot of great things to connect to on the site. I've gone through it and links, so it's pretty easy to move through it. And it just really pulls you in. Which great animation can do. You'll be pulled in, and then then you've lost some wonderful time into that animation.
Awesome.
Like I said,
you did so much research. I love it.
I do, and you kind of I'm not trying to be like that, but you're kind of a big hitter too. I mean, you're getting there's awards, you're working with great teams, you're doing great stuff. So it's really a great pleasure to talk to you and for folks here on the podcast to just kind of go deeper here into like some really cool stuff, some of these big art questions and animation. And as you know, Elyse, this is an episode I've been wanting to. For us to be able to pull together for some time. And so I really appreciate the opportunity that it has happened, and love hearing about you in Washington, D.C., a place I like, and talking about architecture and art. And I just want to congratulations overall and you and your team and all the folks who contribute, and also with what you'll be doing through Neon Zoo and the other things that you do. So I really look forward to seeing more.
Thank you. And I almost feel like it's good that it took us so long to get here, because we've had so much more to talk about.
Isn't it? It's quite the interesting thing, to kind of just pull, eventually pull things together, and to see, of course, like you said, with Neon Zoo, everybody check out that website, and it's .co. It sticks out because I just think a company, and it's a company. So that's how I remember it. I think things need to be conspicuous for human beings to remember them nowadays. That's my theory. I don't know if science.
I love it. I'm gonna take that and run with it, and it'll make me feel better when I see that co.
Go with it. That's what I say. Company right off the bat. Anyways,
Perfect.
Maybe it doesn't work. I don't know. The podcast guy says it does work. Elyse, it's been great chatting with you and meeting you. And everybody check out Elyse Kelly and Neon Zoo Studio and enjoy the art. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's been a lot of fun.
All right.
This is Something Rather Than Nothing,